So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Kim Wilder-Davis, and I specialize in assessment and feedback practice at the University of Glasgow. But before I devoted my entire life to assessment and feedback, I worked in the field of rhetoric and composition. So definitions to me are very important. And some other housekeeping things. So we're going to start with the definition of what a program-focused approach to assessment and feedback is. But before we get started, a couple of my own housekeeping things. I'm a very typical American in that when I get excited about a subject, I tend to speak very quickly. So please feel free to interrupt me and tell me to slow down. As Martha mentioned, feel free to put any questions or have that discussion in the chat, and that we'll have time to really get in depth with those at the end of the session. So let's get started with the fun stuff. So we're going to start with the definition for program-focused approach to assessment and feedback. And the definition that we're going to be working with today is the one that was put forth by Tansy Jessup, where the idea is that degree programs and curriculum design and the curriculum design of an entire degree program focuses on the notion that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So modules are no longer standalone units of learning. They are connected pieces of an entire learning journey. So think of it as creating a roadmap for the students to be able to work through the degree program and understand what they're learning at specific times and how all of these things are connected. So your modules become puzzle pieces in the overall degree program puzzle. They connect in specific ways to help build the overall learning. So this approach includes things like structuring assessment and feedback so that your students can make connections between their current feedback and tasks in subsequent modules. This also allows for the programs to make connections more apparent and more visible to students. So if they're doing something in my module that they're going to then do later in Martha's module, I can talk to them about that. I can give them a heads up to why this learning is important, why this feedback will be useful in the future, and how they can use it. And this is also teaching students how to use that feedback that they're given in more meaningful ways. So helping them understand that concept of feed forward with more concrete examples. And I've given you the link for a really great article that can help illuminate a program-focused approach to assessment in more detail. So you may be thinking, how does this then relate to the idea of resilience? And how does this relate to what we're doing as program leaders? And there have been some issues that were raised in the first iteration of the cluster, as well as continual discussion that has arisen in the last several months with the meetings that we've had. And one of the biggest issues that program leaders feel they're facing is a poorly defined job role. And the issue with this is that sometimes program leaders are just dropped into the role, and there's no set of criteria. There's no kind of rule book of what is expected of them, and there is often not a chance for them to really sit down in and have very long, meaningful conversations with previous program leads to kind of get a lay of the land. So sometimes they're kind of left to figure it out as they go. They're left with trying to fill in blanks only when problems arise. Another issue that comes with this poorly defined role is the idea that program leads have a lot of discretion in the choices that they're making. And an issue with having so much discretionary power is that then it is up to the program lead to often make these decisions by themselves. And within that, there is the feeling of kind of professional isolation and professional invisibility, as it were, because many of the decisions are being made behind the scenes. Many of the decisions are being made without necessarily being able to meet with the entire team together. And so it can cause for this very fractured feeling between the program lead and the program team, or the program team as a whole. And the final issue that has been discussed is the lack of recognition that program leaders often get in this role. They've often been relegated to this invisible superhero type persona, where they are doing a lot of this work because it's fallen on them to do it. And the only recognition and reward that they get comes from the time they spend with their students or with team members, kind of on an individual basis, whether that's through mentoring or teaching. And there isn't a formal promotions pathway for many program leaders where they then get to discuss the things that they have done and really kind of share and brag about the things that they're doing. So these are issues that are continually plaguing the PL roles, and these have been the focus of the conversations that we've been having, because one of the big focuses in this cluster is that idea of resilience and what keeps us going and the ways in which we can foster that. So what are the barriers then to the program-focused approach? I've been doing this for about 6 years. I have heard lots of things, lots of reasons why programs do not want to take up this approach. One of them that usually is the first thing that most people say to me is that it's too time intensive. It just takes too long to map out a program and to figure out when all of the assessments are happening and where the connections are made and how you discuss them and, you know, what that journey looks like for a student. And they just don't have that time. They don't think they have that time to sit down and really do that work together. The second issue, and it's one that we will hear about later, is that it's logistically impractical to organize. So the idea of getting an entire program team in a room together to be able to have these conversations is asking a lot of our program teams. Again, the very first program I ever worked with, they had so many optional courses and so many ways for students to engage with the program that there were actually 57 different pathways for a student to get their degree. Let that sink in for a second. 57 different ways between the combination of optionals. So asking them to sit down as an entire program team was just almost impossible, because you may have one student doing a particular pathway, And all of those optional courses weren't necessarily part of the program on a regular basis. So working them in and building in that roadmap didn't make sense. And there was a lot of conversation that then had to work around, and there were lots of things that needed to be done in terms of making sure that the program understood why having so many options wasn't necessarily a good thing. But the last thing that programs are always really worried about is this idea that a program-focused approach creates these false connections between modules. So we looked at in the definition this idea that you're creating this puzzle where all the modules are a piece in that puzzle and they fit together to make the entire picture. But what happens in some of these programs and what happens in some of the current approaches to this is that modules are often seen as these standalone features of a program, and that students are kind of jumping on stones to get through, and it's not a clear route. And sometimes the modules don't have connections to each other, and they don't necessarily need to have these connections towards one another. So by sitting a program down and asking them to look at where these connections exist and to create this through line, there is the fear that you're creating false connections between modules that can then actually hinder a student's learning and engagement with the content, with the course content, and with the skills that they need to be building as they move through a program. But can we do something about this? So can we figure out a way to make the program-focused approach work for us? And what we're going to hear for the next few minutes is two perspectives on ways in which we can make this work. And what I want you to focus on while you're listening to these is the idea of what would be useful to you and how you could make a program-focused approach work for you in terms of creating defined job roles, building on these hidden roles that a program leader has, and working towards the idea of creating a space where everybody can come together as a team to share the workload. So we're going to start with Alex Buckley, and he's going to talk us through his experience using Testa. So Alex, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. Shall I get my slides up, or are they up?
And you should be able to now control the screen as well.
How do I move between slides?
You should be able to take control from me.
It's disabled by the Share a Company's administrator.
Martha.
I don't know who that is. But it's apparently, yeah, the request control button is grayed out. I've only got 3 slides.
Okay, well, if you want to tell me when to move to the next one, I can move you to the next one.
Thank you very much. Okay, right. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, I was just going to talk a bit. I was going to talk for 10 minutes about a couple of thoughts about program-focused assessment as a way of, I don't know, sparking a conversation, hopefully. Just a couple of points. The biggest challenge I experienced in helping program teams think through assessment, and a particular challenge that can arise if things don't work properly. So, okay, so for a few years, up until about a year ago when I moved to Heriot Watt, my job was to help program teams to think about how assessment and feedback were working across their program using the Testa model, if those of you who have heard of that. So it involved finding out how students were experiencing the program as a whole, rather than just the individual modules, and then helping, kind of feeding that back to the staff and the program team, and helping them think through whether the modules are fitting together properly or not, and whether they wanted to make any changes. It's a reasonably complicated process. There were quite a few things that I found quite tricky about it, like making sense of all the messy qualitative data, trying to figure out what was going on. But the biggest challenge that I had was quite a boring logistical challenge. And I thought it might just be me, or it might just be the particular university I was doing it at, until I came across this, I think. So can we move to the next slide? So this is from a kind of book chapter that turned into a blog post by Chris Rust. In it he talks, it's called Rethinking Assessment, a Program Leader's Guide, which you may have come across. So he talks a lot about a lot of really complicated issues in assessment, and about different important aspects of program coordination of assessment, like assessment literacy and feedback literacy, and lots of complicated things. And then right at the end, he says this: ridiculously, probably the hardest requirement for many programs will be the initial bringing together of the faculty concerned, getting them to see themselves as a program team and to accept the idea of jointly, collaboratively designing the program together. And that first bit, bringing them together, was the biggest challenge I had. So the process, as we did it, the way we did test it kind of culminated in a long meeting with the program team to talk through the findings, so students' perspectives. And it was a complete nightmare scheduling those program meetings and getting people to turn up. And it wasn't just me, I was doing it with the program lead, and sometimes the director of teaching in the department, and sometimes the head of department, and sometimes there'd be faculty involvement, but it was always really hard to get a critical mass of the program team there. It really wasn't something that people did very often, and it's quite revealing. In many ways, they were teams in name only, and it was kind of the most obvious evidence of that was how hard it was to get them in a room together to talk about how they assess their modules. That's all pre-COVID, so when I say get in a room together, I meant physically get in a room together. We presented, so at those meetings, we presented a lot of data, tried to have conversations about some of the kind of nitty-gritty of assessment, some of the complicated stuff, but the best bits were when someone would just turn around in a discussion and go, "Oh wow, I didn't realize you were assessing like that. That's really interesting. I'll try that." Or, "Oh, I could tweak what I do so that builds into your module." And there were kind of these organic conversations, and those kinds of realizations of the value of, "Oh yeah, that's interesting," finding out what you did and linking it together with what I do, they were the most valuable thing. That was gold dust. We did have ways of like evaluating how well it was working, because it takes quite a lot of time and money. So we had ways of figuring out, is it having an impact? But for me, the thing I always wanted to see was somebody just saying, "Oh, this was really useful. We should do this again sometime." And that, if someone said that, if there was a desire at least to have more discussions about how we're all assessing, and how we could kind of have a chat about it, figure out what each other's doing, learning more, kind of maybe connecting together a bit more the modules, then I was happy. As long as somebody said that, I was happy. Okay, that was the first point. I just wanted to say something very quickly about the kinds of issues that can crop up in my experience with program teams if they don't have that program focus. And the main problem, it always seemed to me, was wasted effort. So in the modern world of academia, where everyone's rather busy, like wasted effort is just, that's the biggest. Like if somebody is spending time on something and it's not worth it, that's the biggest, like that's an emergency, right? So there seem to be various ways in which a lack of program coordination was leading to people wasting their time. So you'd get people who were coming up with really interesting and innovative and well thought through forms of assessment, but like in the third year, but the students had never been prepared for that assessment. Nothing had ever built towards it, and they were completely flummoxed by it, and the assessment was a bit of a dismal failure. Or somebody providing lovely, really detailed, rich, constructive feedback, but because of the nature of the program, the students never got a chance to use that feedback in a later course. So that was a later module. So that was a bit of a waste of time. One area where the thought and effort of staff can be wasted sometimes is in the competition between modules that are happening at the same time in a program. So people will put a lot of thought into what their own modules look like, but if there isn't some kind of coordination, they can end up competing. Kim, can you put the next and final slide? Okay, so this is the idea of the arms race, which is, I think is quite an interesting idea. So people use graded assessments, so they use assessments that carry marks to try and get students to study. We're all familiar with that, I'm sure. So if you like that sort of thing, you will call it consolidation or in student engagement or providing motivation. If you don't like it, you like pedagogy of control is the way I've seen it described. But the issue, I think, one issue with it is when people are thinking about that, they'll think, okay, I want to get students I want to help provide them with some motivation to work. I want them to do some work, so I'm going to set a graded assessment. So it's a relationship between them and the students on their course, but it's also a relationship with your colleagues, because by setting a kind of graded assessment, you're trying to, partly what you're doing is trying to persuade the students to spend time on your module and not another module. Not me. Okay. To spend time, put effort into their module rather than another module. And so that kind of, where you've got people competing, that can lead, in this paper presents this as to an arms race where assessments are proliferating. So this is a really nice article about program coordination of assessment. Students felt stressed by being continuously assessed. Lecturers recognized this set of circumstances, but to compete for student time, they had to set grades for all work. This state of affairs resulted in an assessments arms race between lecturers who controlled student study behavior with grading. So you can see how this is going to work, right? If you want your students to do some work, you set them a graded assessment, but if really you're competing with your colleagues, then your colleagues are going to end up having to do that. And this can all happen unconsciously, but soon we've kind of got runaway over assessment because we're competing for students' attention. So to stop that cycle, there has to be more coordination at program level. So people teaching concurrent modules in a program need to have more chats and discussion about what they're doing in their modules. I mean, the best example of this is like purely formative, ungraded assessment. So I've come across that in programs where people would say, I've got these I really want students to do assessments for the sake of learning. So I've got these lovely formative assessments. They don't carry any marks, and the students just won't engage with them. And then you talk to the students, and the students say, well, yeah, but that's because I've got a graded assessment in another course at the same time. So which one am I going to put effort into? Okay, so they were just a couple of quick points that I think or hope it's useful for program leads to think about. In terms of the lessons for program leads, I guess for me, it's the importance of getting people in a room, helping program teams to get together and discuss how they assess, but also the difficulty of that we shouldn't underestimate either the power of getting people in a room having those conversations, but also it might sound simple, but it can be quite hard. That's the end of what I wanted to say.
Excellent. So what we will do is we'll hold off on questions. You can pop them into the chat. And what we'll do now is we will move to Bryden Stillie, who is going to talk about it from an actual program lead and LTA perspective. So Bryden, if you are ready, I have your slides, and again, can control them for you as you are ready to move to the next one.
Okay, it might be easier if I can share, if that's all right. It's just that there's a few bullet points that will come in one after the other.
Yeah, if you have access to do that, I can.
Yeah, I'm good to do that, I think. Yeah. Can everybody see that now? Can you see that now? Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much, Kim, for introduction there. Yeah, I'm Bryden Stillie. I'm from Edinburgh Napier University. I am the head of learning and teaching for the School of Arts and Creative Industries. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the experience I've had in terms of developing a program-focused approach to learning, teaching and assessment. So I'm going to cover this LTA design part. I'm going to cover a bit about course development dialogues, which obviously Kim and Alex have already kind of talked about a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about how we kind of manage the interactions between the modules. This was when I was a program leader. So this was basically the beginning of where we started to look at program focus. Now, pretty much, I would say about 50% of those post-its that are on there are about how we link assessments together. Some of the highlighted activities, you can see that's about where we're linking assessments, but there's also lots and lots of different program enhancements that we wanted to make when we went through. This was our program review in 2014-15. So while we were going through that review, the first thing that I set out was basically a set of guiding principles. I wanted people to link the curriculum and the assessment where they can across modules, right? So in our modules within the music department, a lot of them are sequenced, you know, so if you're doing first year, you'll do performance 1, then it's performance 2, performance 3, performance 4. So you could easily see how, you know, feedback and assessment would link as you move through those modules in a performance pathway. However, that's not the case if you're doing, say, performance then composition. You know, at that time, lots of the modules sat in silos and weren't interacting with each other. We also looked at formative assessment opportunities, and this is what, like, my first sort of big bugbear. I hate calling it formative assessment, and I think that when we call it formative assessment, as Alex says, you know, students are kind of turned off by formative assessment because it's not credit bearing for them. So what we do basically is a lot of the time we just call it learning experiences and like feedback experiences. So getting away from that use of formative assessment as language has helped, I think, and engage the students. We also want to make sure that the assessment experiences are valuable. And this was a guiding principle for the staff when they were getting involved in making these changes. We also went for a consistency in assessment, and also we went for integrating most appropriate feedback methods and consistency in the quality of feedback as well. The final thing that we asked as a guiding principle of the colleagues was that feed forward became a standard within any feedback that we gave to students. So how did we do this? So yeah, we had to have development dialogue. Development dialogue was probably the most important thing that we did to begin with. And the thing is that you need to involve all your stakeholders. So from a staff perspective, we have Friday morning meetings where we would normally just discuss general business around the department. Through this review, we gave over those Friday morning meetings to having those discussions within the team. Now, I was a program leader from 2008 to 2015, and throughout that point, I think I'd actually built a really strong team ethos around us. And we all had similar values, and that really helped in terms of making sure that the discussions were centred around improving student experience. Through those discussions, we actually asked all the staff to do presentations on the modules that they taught. And that then sparked discussions around where we could see the synergies and the links. We then made decisions on what we were going to do. We set up work streams, and the work streams had a lead that was, you know, maybe the lead for contextual studies, or the lead for performance, or the lead for technology. And within each of those streams were the people who, or work streams, groups were the people who had recognised synergies with their own modules. So while it generated quite a lot of meetings, I think we ended up with some amazing ideas of what the deliverables would be at the end. We also made sure that we spoke to students. Students gave us some great ideas about where they saw modules and assessments linking together. And that was like going through the process of going to quality, but also post-decision. We continually keep chatting to our students about their experience of the assessment, feedback, and then also learning and teaching on the course. We also spoke to alumni. We got lots of feedback from them. It was about 40,000 words of feedback from our alumni, and that really informed pre-development. And then also we had liaison groups with industry to make sure that what we were covering within the course was going to be suitable. Remember that changes will take time to filter through, but it is worth it. If I tell you that prior to this point, in fact, actually, when we were in about 2014, we were sitting mid-table in terms of NSS and league tables for like Times and Sunday Times Good University Guide. And there now we're actually the top UK modern in the UK, and I think that is absolutely as a result of the way that we've approached engaging students, engaging staff, changing the programme to make sure that it all speaks to each other, all the modules speak to each other. So this is kind of the programme focused learning and teaching map. We've got sort of 4 main tenets to our programme, and every single element of learning and teaching links to every other module. So, for example, I can give you one for contextual studies, where our students study sampling of music. So, like they look at the copyright aspects of that, they look at the technologies in terms of a historical perspective. In the technology module, they're learning how to use those technologies. In the performance module, they're actually using the technologies in performance. And the composition module, they're actually using those technologies to compose music, which sometimes they'll actually use to perform after that as well. So there's a lot of linking of the learning and teaching before we even think about how the assessments are going to link together. So we also decided that our feedback, I mentioned earlier on that the feedback was always going to be something that we were consistent about, and we were always going to integrate the best methods. So when we think about that, we had written methods, we had verbal methods, video feedback for some modules where students were doing projects in music technology, so we could actually give video feedback of how they'd interacted with the software, and then audio feedback as well for certain aspects that we were covering within the course. The big thing that I think made a big difference to the students was that marks were always derived using a self-calculating rubric. Now, because of that, there's no academic judgment. That's my second bugbear. I can't stand academic judgment when we get into assessment. It should be something that you can actually derive a grade correctly rather than just choosing, I think. I mean, everyone will have their own opinion on that, but for me, I like to have things that I can define. Feedback always speaks to the criteria. Feed forward is a standard. The criteria are linked to the module learning outcomes, and then we also do a lot of peer assessment throughout modules, and peer feedback and critiques always given using plussing as a methodology. So I don't know if you know the plussing methodology from Pixar, but it's basically a critique of the work and then an and the and is, and this is a way that you might be able to improve it. And that's worked brilliantly for us in terms of putting a positive slant on any feedback that students give to each other, but also we use that approach ourselves in the feedback that we present for students. And so just give you a couple of ways that we've linked interact or show the interactions, I suppose, between activities that students do. So the one in yellow is the only summative assessment within this module, but every one of these assessments that you can see along the top, which is the task, every one of those is a peer assessed assessment. So basically we have a peer assessment, they provide feedback on a rubric, they also give verbal feedback using plussing as a methodology, and then they also provide that feed forward for the students. So we have 4 interventions throughout this module, and then at the end there's a summative assessment where tutor provides feedback and then gives feed forward. Here's one that we actually have a bit of cross-module, so this is like program level. So we have performers who work on studio sessions, they're involved in peer feedback and feed-forward sessions, and then you can see that the recording engineers and the performance students link together for their assessment, which is about the experience of doing like their specialism effectively. So they perform in the studio, and it's their experience of being the performers, and then the recording engineers, what's their experience of recording. Now they're actually in the same class, giving the presentations one after each other, and then playing the piece that's been recorded. That similar approach works through the rest of this term, and then at the end we have an observed session where the students who are performers are performing in the studio, we're observing their performances, and then the recording engineers were observing the way that they interact with the performers and the processes in the studio. I think the program-focused assessment part, we always try to use assessment, feedback, and feed-forward opportunities to scaffold learning. You know, we see our learning in our program as being as a journey, I suppose. And every intervention that we have as we go through with students, whether that's a formative assessment or a summative assessment, the feedback and feed-forward opportunities are always linking forward towards the next modules that they're going to study within that module, within that pathway, sorry. We also look for ways to make the assessments inter-reliant. Like just as I showed you there in those cross-module assessments, I was actually making a note of just some of the ones that I could get off the top of my head. And I think I've got about 8 or 9 that I can just think of that I know of from modules that I'm teaching on that speak to each other across modules. You know, for example, it might be the ensemble and the tech modules in 3rd year, or it could be the fact that our teaching modules in the 3rd year are supporting formative assessment in the tech modules in our 1st year, or it could be something like the entrepreneurship module in the 3rd year, where they're building a record label. It actually supports all years for students who are performers or producers and gives them the opportunity to release music. So we look at all the ways to make these assessments inter-reliant. As I've just mentioned there, we link the assessments across the modules. We also foster opportunities for student collaboration. And that's such an important part about getting a cohesive learning experience for students, because in my discipline, nobody is just a recording engineer. A lot of them are recording engineers, but they'll play an instrument, they'll also work, they'll compose probably a little bit as well. And we try to bring everybody together to get as many different opportunities for student collaboration as possible. And then we create opportunities for students to examine and develop their practice through different yet related lenses. Now, when I think about the program Focused L&T, where we had our 4 strands of the program and all the different links, you know, I can say, you know, that, you know, if you're a performer, you're going to be performing music that you're studying about in the contextual studies. You're also going to be recording that music, and you're also going to be using that as an influence on the way that you might compose music for the composition modules. So we're looking at ways that we can change up the way that students will, you know, maybe come in, study one topic, but see the links across those other ones through the assessments and the activities that they're doing within the other classes. And don't be afraid to try something new. I mean, it's really interesting. I saw Errol was on this call earlier on, and I was absolutely inspired by him to try gamifying formative assessment. And that it's turned into an absolutely brilliant set of assessments within one of my modules that will link to a module that's subsequent to that in the 4th year now, where it'll feed into student projects related to education. So I think that's one of the things that I've got out of this, is that, you know, there's so many different opportunities that you can look at. And if you're always thinking about the pathway that the students are going through, rather than, you know, sitting in your own silo looking at your own modules, you'll come up with some great ideas to really support that student learning experience. Okay, I think that's me, Kim.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bryden and Alex. I think what we will do now is, before we move into the question and discussion part of this, we will take a 5-minute comfort break. So this is your chance to refill your tea, get up and flail around and stretch for a minute, or get your questions composed and ready to ask our fabulous panel. So let's take a comfort break, and then we'll come back in about 5 minutes, and we'll move on to the question and discussion section of this. Bryden, there's something that you said to me once that I will never forget when we talked about your program, and you said that you saw feedback as just another learning opportunity. And I tell everybody that. And I tell everybody how I wish I could clone you to have millions of people who see feedback in that way.
I'll tell you what's even more complicated in music is that when people think about instrumental lessons, they think about somebody's a teacher, but they're not. They're just continually providing formative feedback all the time, you know. And while you might demonstrate some stuff within a class, actually, the next thing that happens is that you become the formative feedback person again. So, yeah, and I think that's why maybe from my perspective, I don't like the formative assessment part of it, because, you know, we see that as just learning within our subject area. So, and supporting learning, I suppose.
Yeah, it's why I've been trying to push assessment literacy so that students do understand why we're asking them to do things, and see it as that, see it as just another opportunity for learning and not as an assessment. Because the minute you say assessment, it brings an entire connotation, often negative, to what they're doing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. Yeah.
if we could all start kind of coming back together. So I hope I've allowed enough time for tea to brew. I never quite know how long it takes. Alex, okay, you made it back. So clearly you've gotten your tea.
It was close.
Okay.
It was a close shave, but I just about did it.
Yeah, I am not, even though I've been living here for almost 10 years, I'm still not an expert in how long it takes to brew a good cup of tea. I blame my California upbringing. We only drink iced tea.
It just takes the amount of time for the adverts in Coronation Street. So they say.
So we are going to move into the question and discussion phase of this event. It doesn't look like anybody right now has raised any questions, but I do have a couple of questions for you both, if that is okay. And maybe that'll get people kind of thinking about things they'd like to ask as well. So my first question is actually for Bryden, because you worked as a program lead. And one of the issues that we had discussed and has been an ongoing discussion in these sessions and in the first iteration of this cluster was the poorly defined job role and what that means in terms of how a program leader feels as they are in this role. So do you think, having utilized a program-focused approach, do you think that that helped you define your role as a program leader at all?
Yeah, I think it did. I think up till that point, I was defining my role, I think, trying to make sure that people knew what I was actually responsible for within the programme. But also, I think, well, fundamentally, I think the most important thing is that as a programme leader, you've got to be seen to lead by example. And as soon as people see you doing that, I think a lot of the time you can onboard people, you know. And yeah, I mean, I think the role, I think it takes certain people to do that role, I think, you know, and there's no doubt about that. It's not a well-defined role. While we've tried to define it like for a long time, I think that most program leaders would come back and say, I have all the responsibility and I've got the title, but I've got no power. You know, so a lot of the time they're not the line managers of the people that they work with. They don't have the ability to demand things of people effectively, you know. And that's why I'm saying that it's so important to make those relationships work with your peers and with your colleagues, because if you've got good relationships and you've got good leadership skills, then actually you can get an awful lot of that achieved just through that, you know. And I think apart from anything else, people have to have trust in you that you're doing it for the right reasons, you know. But I think going for a program focus, while it defined me as the program leader, as in the person getting through the changes and making sure that everything was happening, I've actually been able to give up that role. And in the last 5 years, we've had 4 program leaders because everybody took on that responsibility at some point to lead a work stream. So we built capacity through this process as well. And I think that has been a big step forward within the department, because people used to probably lean on me quite heavily, and I don't know how many times I had to complete work for external examiners and get it in the right place, you know, on a Moodle site or something on behalf of somebody, because people saw that as the program leader's role. But I think going through this process, it built a bit of resilience within the department as well. And, you know, with what's been going on in the last year, as you might imagine, you know, for a practical music program, it has been pretty horrendous. But I'll tell you, we have come up with some amazing assessments because of it. Things that the students are actually saying, you know, we wouldn't have normally done this, but I think it's maybe better. So, moving forward, we're looking at ways that we're going to change our program based on what's happened in this last year, which means that, we can obviously strengthen the student experience even more just by accessing those technologies. But I think it all comes from building that collective understanding within the team that this is a good thing to do. And I think defining the role, it probably helped to define the role, but it probably helped other people understand more of what that role actually was and then step up.
Excellent. Thank you. Alex, can I ask you about this question that was raised earlier in the kind of practicality of how we move away from the competition between modules that comes with assessment design?
Yeah, how do we move away? So I think, the most basic answer is just to get people talking to each other so that they start to process that. So like the tester thing is trying to shift people to the student's perspective. So students study programs, we teach modules. That's, I guess, the tester mantra, right? So So anything we can do to try and get people to see, okay, outside the students are doing other stuff at the same time as your course. And so you need to bear that in mind. Like that's quite the way of putting it, but like how good your course is not up to you. Like, because it's not about what you do in isolation, whether your course is any good. Sorry, when I say course, I mean module. When your module is any good, whether it is, depends on the context. So it's just getting people to have that mindset. But there are bigger issues. That the Harlan paper that I quoted from is kind of the idea is this all happened when we introduced student choice, and then academics were competing for bums on seats. And so they need their students to pay attention to their own. So it's like competition was an intended outcome. So there are bigger things going on, but I mean, just getting people chatting would be the
key. I would agree with that. I think one of the things that I would say too is the idea of program focused approach is so that you see what assessments everybody's doing. You see where you can link the learning, and it takes the competition out in that sense, because you're saying, oh, if you're doing this over here, I can do this over here, and it builds on that. And also the idea of program focus actually also helps reduce the number of assessments that are done across the program as well, which can be very helpful. So there was also a question or a point raised about the shift in terminology, and I think Bryden had a good point in this, in the fact that you want them to see it as a learning opportunity. You want your students to engage with the formative, and sometimes when we put a formal title like formative assessment, the fact that we've said assessment changes the way that a student will engage and sees that. Assessment is not always seen as a good thing to students. So calling something even formative where they don't get any marks, an assessment, still kind of scares them, because it's the idea that somebody is still providing feedback to them. Someone's still looking at their work. If you help encourage assessment literacy as well with your students, and you really take the time to build that knowledge, you teach them the purpose of assessment, the different ways they're going to see it, why they are doing it, how to engage with it, and the importance of that engagement, as well as using their feedback, so feedback literacy as well, then that can help to mitigate some of that stress around assessment. But calling it something else, changing that terminology and reclaiming that as a learning space and just an opportunity for learning is a worthwhile idea, and it is worth looking into and worth considering. One of the things you can do at a program level, if you're if you're thinking about this approach, is you can decide together as a team what that looks like and what you call it and how you engage with it, so that there's a consistent message across the program and a consistent expectation that comes between modules. And I think that can be really helpful in terms of that engagement. But certainly teaching students assessment and feedback literacy like it is a foundational skill, like you would in your discipline, goes a long way to helping that engagement and to helping students in that understanding of why they're being asked to do things and how they can engage with it and continue that learning journey. So it makes connections easier as well. There's been some.
Can I maybe just chip in on the back of that, Kim?
Of course you can.
Yeah, so one of the approaches that we thought about, we actually implemented not long after the review, was that when we were providing student feedback, we actually asked the students to summarize it back to us and then provide their grade after that. So they knew that they had to summarize it and have a think about what the feedback meant for them before we actually provided a grade from the rubric for them, which worked really well. It's not been something we've done over this last year, obviously, but just an awful lot going on to manage that on top of it. But that'll be something that we regularly will go back to, you know? Yeah.
So it looks like there have been a couple of comments. Okay, so Jason asked, have modules that sit across programs, and how does that work in terms of assessment? So either one of you, any of us can jump in for that. I have worked with programs that have that. I don't know, Bryden, if you did.
I've got one. Yeah, I actually teach one. So I have a module called Instrumental Vocal Teaching that we run for the classical program and the popular music program at Napier. And on that module, basically, we have, it's taught across two programs, basically. The cohort of students in there is from two different programs. But what we're also doing with that is we look for the next module in that chain, you know, which is another module that's taught across two programs. And that module is obviously Instrumental Vocal Teaching 2, surprise, surprise. But likewise, every assessment that we do within the first module will build to a point where someone's going on to onto that next module, and they'll have a solid foundation for you. And I suppose as a lecturer, there's a huge benefit in the fact that you know that when people start your module, they've got the prerequisite knowledge that they need to have, because they've had the feedback, they've had the assessment, you know that it's been constructively aligned rather than just within one module. You're actually looking at constructive alignment from the first point where they start on that pathway. You know, so your learning outcomes and your assessment are aligned to the next module where, you know, so when you think about designing in pathways like that, it makes the program focus a little bit easier, I think. Yeah, it's a bit more difficult if you've just got one module that sits across a couple of programs, unless you can see synergies with other areas within the students' disciplines. But, you know, I think that works pretty well, you know?
Yeah. Definitely. And I think too, so Colin's question was around kind of program focus at an institutional level, and whether or not you needed, you could do with one program that's your trailblazer, you had, cross-program synergy, which is a very fantastic phrase that I think I probably need to use more of. I think, so the nature of programs can be very different. So it can be difficult at an institutional level to say, see this program over here and how great it utilized program focused approach. Now you're going to do this over here. There is a bit of individuality that kind of comes with that, but that's why there are models and methods that you can use that kind of give you those foundations to kind of work it out as a team, and then you figure out as a team what helps and what doesn't help in terms of bringing your programs together. Oh, okay. So Errol asked what we think of the program-focused approach as a way of fighting academic or professional isolation.
Yeah. Sorry, on you go, Alex.
That just makes me think of a thing that a guy called Graham Gibbs, if you've heard of him, he used to say the thing about the key to like program-focused assessment, but also kind of bigger things about sharing what we do as teachers and stuff, was like buy a fancy coffee machine. Like I mean, this is a few years ago, but like buy a fancy coffee machine. People then, they like fancy coffee. They go, they get their fancy coffee. In the process of getting it, they have a chat about, oh, I'm just, what they're annoyed about with their assessments, or, oh, thinking of trying something new. Have you got any ideas about this? And then suddenly you kind of get that ripple effect. Now, I think one of the things, I don't know if he said this, but is that sometimes that exists for research terms. So it's kind of, you might have things people who feel professionally isolated, but it might be that they feel professionally isolated when it comes to the teaching part of their role, but not the research part. They might have loads of stuff going on, but teaching wise, it's just, I just get on with it. And there could be lots of reasons for that. So I think, yeah, I mean, if they're feeling isolated as professionals, then it can help. But even if they're just feeling isolated with it when it comes to teaching, I think it can help as well.
Yeah, I would say that I think the idea of program focus is getting everybody in a room together to chat and have these conversations. And I'm not going to lie, Glasgow did buy a fancy coffee machine and put it in our teaching room. We have a small teaching room in our building. They put it in there, and we all do spend a lot of time with that fancy coffee machine and chatting. But it's that idea that we can get in a room together, have these conversations. Alex, you mentioned that sometimes the best part for you is when staff turn to each other and say, I didn't know you were doing that. I might try that. Or, oh, that sounds interesting. So then it encourages those conversations that may not be had otherwise if you're just kind of sticking your head down and getting on with things. So I do think that it is a good way to really kind of combat this isolated kind of feeling. It's also a good chance to regularly check in with your team so that everybody knows what everybody's doing. And suddenly that kind of lack of recognition goes away because you can all talk about these examples of good practice, or you can get help to enhance what you're currently doing. And that comes from being able to put people in a room and let them work to their strengths. And that doesn't always happen if people are kind of working in that kind of module silo, the same way it would as if you're working as a whole cohesive team.
Yeah, I'm totally rumbled now because I actually bought a coffee machine, but I didn't realize that was what was happening. But I think it's an interesting one that Errol raises there, because I think the way that we've kind of approached this, I mean, we didn't have a particularly research active department. We had one or two members of staff who were research active. Now everybody's research active, and we've actually submitted a music submission to the ref, which is amazing. But what we did though was we made sure that within the presentations that people were given, it wasn't just about their content that they would teach within a module. It was what the research interests were about. So it also meant that there was conversations going on about where the synergy was between research aspects within the programme as well, rather than, well, you do a bit of research on that, well, I don't really know how that links with what I could do. Conversations started at that point around, all right, you're doing it about, like popular music education. You're doing something about composition in that area. Well, actually, I'm doing something about like face-to-face teaching on instruments in that area. Let's bring that together and put that in the module. We also put on research seminars where the staff actually got up and spoke to the students about what it was they were doing research-wise. So it opened up the conversation, I think, around, what we were doing in terms of, our research profiles, but also how that was linking in with the teaching. And I think that also meant that people started to feel more valued in the team, rather than, oh, they're doing research, they're really important. It's actually, we're all now doing research. And actually, everything that we've got to say is really important for our students. They want to value what we're doing. And I think that's a great way to break down that barrier of feeling like, you know, you've got your silo module that sits outside the programme. None of them do now. They're all brought in because of, you know, the links that we see.
Yeah,